Angus Taylor, welcome to 7:30.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
Quick question on the big news of the day in the world. Were you relieved to see Kamala Harris perform well in the debate?
I'm not going to get involved in US politics tonight, Sarah. I'll stick with our politics here at home. That's interesting enough. I'll leave American politics to others.
All right, let's talk about the Reserve Bank. You know, we had the Treasurer on last night. The independent review into the Reserve Bank called for a new structure for the RBA. You supported it. The Governor wants it. The current board members themselves are looking for ways to make it work. Who wins by blocking the reform?
Well, can I start by saying, Sarah, that the objective here is to fight and beat what is high and persistent inflation in Australia. Indeed, it's higher and more persistent than any other major advanced country in the world. Now, the government has an important role to play in that. It has many, many levers it can pull to fight and beat that inflation. But the Reserve Bank has an important role too in the one lever it has, which is setting interest rates. Now, we laid out right throughout this process that's been going for 18 months, red line issues for us. The first was to keep faith to the independence, credibility and commitment to that independent Reserve Bank that we all want to see. And secondly, and crucially, that there be continuity of the current board to the new interest rate setting board, that there would be an automatic transfer of that board membership. The government has not kept faith with either of those principles, and we've seen that in recent days. We've seen legislation come forward that leaves a pathway for the Treasurer to sack and stack the board. We've seen...
Let me just jump in there, because obviously there has been a lot of debate between you and the Treasurer over recent months arriving at this point. The position that he has arrived at and presented to you is that all members would participate in the rate-setting board unless they expressed a desire not to. Now, why would you want to force someone onto a board who's offered their services to the governance board?
We simply wanted an automatic transfer of the current board to the interest rate setting board. It's as simple as that. That was what we asked for. It's not what's in the legislation. It's not what the Treasurer came to. We were clear about that from a long way back. But can I also say, Sarah, that the government has breached faith with other parts of what I just laid out. And in particular, we've seen a war of words between the government and the Reserve Bank in recent weeks. In fact, in recent months, it's intensified in the last week, led out by the Treasurer in the last week and then followed up by proxies and surrogates using extraordinary language, calling the Reserve Bank board a bunch of weirdos and describing the Governor as a nutter. And I couldn't think of a less appropriate word for the description.
And I think the Treasurer was absolutely clear that he repudiated that language. I would ask you, Angus Taylor, just to stay with this question, because we're talking about who's going to sit on the rate-setting board, and the offer to you was that all members of the current board would be transferred to the rate-setting board unless they expressed a desire not to do that, to assist the Governor with continuity on the governance board. Why is that something you cannot accept?
Well, because we wanted an automatic transition. And frankly, Sarah, what the Treasurer decided to do is force the current board members onto one of the two boards, a forced process to do that. He might describe it as choice. You and I don't know how that process has unfolded, but there was an easy solution to that: just transfer the current board over. And the reason this is so important is if we're to fight and beat inflation, Sarah, we need stability, we need continuity. The Reserve Bank is not perfect, it hasn't been perfect, but it's been a very, very effective institution in keeping a strong growth, low inflation in this country for many decades. So we wanted to keep faith with that continuity. And look, there are many aspects to us losing trust in the Treasurer on this process. Right from the beginning, the Treasurer, on the day the review came out, he made 2 appointments where there was no genuine consultation. We were informed of the decision. That's his version of consultation.
Is it therefore your contention that the appointments of Ian Ross and Elena Rubin, that they were not suitable candidates for the Reserve Bank board?
It was our contention that it didn't follow the very process that had been recommended in the review that the Treasurer had accepted on that day.
But as it is, do you regard Ian Ross and Eleanor Rubin as suitable candidates for the Reserve Bank board?
As I've said many times, I'm not going to get into assessment of candidates. What I am going to say is there was a process laid out in the review. That process was all about making sure we maintain this independent, credible, capable Reserve Bank. The Treasurer ignored it on day one, and there were good reasons to question his motives around board appointments from that day. Now, we've worked with the Treasurer over 18 months. Frankly, there were extraordinary delays in responses to the red line issues that we laid out very early in the process. But what remains is a pathway for the Treasurer to sack and stack the board if he chooses to do that.
Let me just quote that. So the Governor of the Reserve Bank herself says that continuity means, for her, means some continuity with respect to both boards. She's not insisting on 100% continuity. But let's go back to the review itself, because it found that the Reserve Bank Board's composition and decision-making have not sufficiently enabled it to shape policy strategy and the RBA's underlying analysis and judgments. So if this process underway now, where a position could be made available, why would you not welcome the potential for a fresh appointment, given those findings in the review?
Because we want to see, and wanted to see from the start, evolution, not revolution. We wanted to see stability in fighting and beating inflation. And we didn't want a process whereby the independence of the Reserve Bank could be breached by a Treasurer who sacked and stacked the board. Now, that pathway has been left open, sadly. We wish it was otherwise. We now need to get on with the job of holding, from our side, holding the government to account on the levers it has, and it has many, to beat this persistent high inflation. As I say, we're at the back of the pack in beating this. And on the other hand, letting the Reserve Bank do its job. It needs stability and certainty at this point. It's time to move on.
So the Governor of the Reserve Bank, as I said before, she wants these reforms. How do you explain to her, given that she wasn't insisting on 100% continuity, how do you explain to her that after all this time, having been such a fervent supporter of change at the Reserve Bank, that you won't support it now?
Well, because we're a fervent supporter of not sacking and stacking the board, Sarah. Look, we were absolutely clear on this from day one.
What would it take for you to reopen negotiations with the government?
Well, there's no potential for that. It's time to move on. Look, we've got an election coming up, that's a time period, it's a window where politicisation of reserve banks or central banks anywhere in the world is always at greater risk. We've got, as I say, persistent high inflation, higher than any other major advanced country in the world and more persistent. And we need to ensure that the government focuses on its job, and it has many important roles to play in bringing down inflation, way more levers, as I say, than the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank can do its job. We all need the clarity and certainty to get on with it.
Now, the government is left with the option of either dropping this reform that you and the government considers to be fundamental in the task of fighting inflation. The option is for them to negotiate with the Greens. Are you comfortable telling the Australian public, telling borrowers, your voters, that you will let the Greens now potentially reshape the form of the Reserve Bank?
Well, that's a choice for the government, not us. But if Jim Chalmers is prepared to negotiate with the Greens on this, it's important to note that the Greens want the government to take the Reserve Bank over and to take the banking system over. If he is prepared to negotiate with the Greens on those terms, when the alternative could have been absolute continuity of the current board, it tells you a lot about what his motives might be, Sarah. And I think it proves to us why it's the right thing now to move on. If the government chooses to negotiate with the Greens, that's a choice for them.
Angus Taylor, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
Thank you.